It's now my pleasure to introduce award-winning author and journalist Mark Bowden, and he is here. He's just backstage. Mark has his roots in daily journalism, first at the News American in his hometown of Baltimore, then at the Philadelphia Inquirer. Mark specialized in long-form journalism at the Inquirer, where no matter how much space his editors gave him, and they gave him a lot, he wanted more. So he took to writing books on the side. One of those books, developed from an Inquirer series, was titled Black Hawk Down. It was a finalist for a National Book Award and the basis for an Oscar-winning film. Black Hawk Down catapulted Mark into a new world. More books and a few screenplays were to follow, as well as a slew of magazine articles. He was a national correspondent for The Atlantic and has been a frequent contributor to Vanity Fair. He also teaches journalism at the University of Delaware. For his intrepid, close-in reporting, Mark has been praised by Malcolm Gladwell as a Woodward who outdoes even Woodward. Mark's new book, The Three Battles of Wanat and Other True Stories, is a collection of his best long-form pieces on war, as well as notable profiles, sports reporting, and essays on culture. His talk today will actually be a conversation with Buzz Bissinger, reporter, magazine writer, and Pulitzer Prize-winning author, in short, another Inquirer alum who made it big. Buzz's highly acclaimed nonfiction writing includes the runaway bestseller Friday Night Lights and A Prayer for the City, a superb account of Philadelphia in the pivotal Randell years. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Mark Bowden and Buzz Bissinger to the Free Library.
Welcome tonight. It really is a pleasure for me to moderate this. How long have we known each other? About 35 years?
Long time.
Mark and I are good friends, but because we're good friends and journalistic colleagues, I often hate him. What happens is, at the Inquirer, I would do a great story, he would do a greater story, then I write Friday Night Lights, and then the son of a bitch writes Black Hawk Down. Then I say, fuck you, I'm gonna up you with Friday Night Lights, then the asshole does Black Hawk Down the movie. Then I do A Prayer for the City, which outside the copies David Cohn bought, sold about 6 copies. And then he does Killing Pablo, he does Bringing the Heat, and then the son of a bitch goes to Vanity Fair, and I say, that's my fucking territory, man, what are you doing? Mark is a good friend, and he is a great, great journalist. And I've known that for a long time. I do think Black Hawk Down was a seminal book. I remember I was on the nonfiction panel for the National Book Awards and really thought it should have won. But that's a whole other story because it's the most political process known to man. It was a phenomenal book that started at the Philadelphia Inquirer, but I really did get a sense of Mark through this latest. You know, book collections of stories can be dangerous. You've kind of read one, you've read them all, they all sound the same, and what really struck me seeing this collection, we'll talk about this, was the absolute breadth of what he writes about, you know, just jotting it down. He wrote about Kim Jong-un, obviously the president, or whatever you want to call him, North Korea, the Battle of Wanat, which is an excruciatingly difficult story about a battle in Afghanistan. And Mark is able to humanize everything and do a brilliant job of storytelling. He wrote about the 12th man, crowd noise at the NFL. He wrote about his own guinea fowls that he collected, most of whom I think were killed by his dog Dewey. He's written about, you know, the bombings, the Boston Marathon bombing, and the lawyer who represented one of the defendants. He wrote about David Simon, the creator of The Wire. He wrote a brilliant story about shit. We'll get that to. I'm sorry, that's what it was about. I don't know how else to put it. But it's the depth of what he writes about that is remarkable to me. And so my first question is, because it's always compelling to me, where do these ideas come from? Do they come from you? Is it something you sort of see in a book, in a magazine, in a newspaper article, editors? You have such great breadth and depth and curiosity. Where do the ideas come from?
Well, I'll get to that in a second, but I just otherwise would like to say I'd like to sit here and listen to Buzz talk about how great I am all night.
Yeah, well,
this would not have happened 35 years ago.
He paid me. He said I could go to. He said I could go to the meal up in the rare books room. So.
You know, I have always been a voracious reader of newspapers and magazines, and now lots of things online. And I just think I'm very curious. And if something strikes me, I think long ago, writing for newspapers, it was my responsibility to find things to write about. Particularly at the Philadelphia Inquirer, editors were not very heavy-handed. You were kind of thrown into the newsroom and expected to come up with stories and figure out how to report them and how to write them. And I loved that approach because it suited me. And I never was short of a list of things that I wanted to go out and work on. So nowadays, generally speaking, if I read about something that makes me wonder how in the world did that happen, or why did this happen in the way that it did, I'll file it away as something that I might want to look into. And I also, at this point, work very closely with editors at The Atlantic and at Vanity Fair. In fact, my editor at Vanity Fair, Cullen Murphy, used to be the editor of The Atlantic, so we've known each other for a long time. And these are very smart people who have even more than I do their finger on the pulse of what people want to read about and want to know about. So nowadays, the work that I do grows out of the lunches or dinners that I have with editors, where I'll throw out ideas of mine and they'll come back with ideas of theirs. So the collection here is really a mix of things that I got interested in or things that they talked me into doing. One other thing I'll say is that when you've worked as long as I have as a journalist, you do, even without intending to, develop areas of specialty. So for instance, when I wrote the book Black Hawk Down, I had never written about the military before, but I made a lot of friends in the military and subsequently in the intelligence community, and I learned a lot about those things which I didn't know before, all of which makes it more likely that I'm going to go back down that road again if there's something that I think I can successfully report. The same thing is true about pro football. I covered the Eagles for 3 seasons with the Philadelphia Inquirer, and I learned a great deal about the world of pro football, and I remain really interested in it. And so I sometimes go back. There are a couple pieces in this collection which are about I think unusual aspects of pro football. So
One thing you do incredibly well is, I mean, you really have struck gold with the military, and I've always wondered about this. I've never covered the military, but I would think they're really a tough nut to crack. I would think they view reporters with suspicion. I imagine a lot of people here have read Black Hawk Down. There's some incredible stories here. How do you get them to trust you? Was it because of Black Hawk Down? But I mean, even with Black Hawk Down, how do you get soldiers to give you such incredible, intimate detail?
Well, like most people, soldiers are dying to tell their stories.
They are, okay.
Yeah, and you're right, though. Very often they're restricted by the rules of their particular units or the agreements that they sign to protect information. But I think it's gotten easier for me because of Black Hawk Down. And nowadays, if I call the Pentagon or if I call a military base or I talk to some representative of a veterans organization, they know who I am and they respect me, and so they'll often be helpful. In the beginning, though, it was really tough. I mean, the way that I was able to crack the nut of Black Hawk Down was through the father of one of the men who was killed. I was getting no traction by going to the military directly and asking to speak to men who fought in Mogadishu, but I just coincidentally had gotten to know the father of one of the 18-year-old.
How did you get to know? I'm just always curious. How did you get to know him? How did you?
What
led to him?
I was writing for the Inquirer Sunday magazine, and every election cycle, they did a cover story on the major candidates for president, and they asked me to do Bill Clinton, which was kind of like the booby prize. Not because I hated Bill Clinton, but because how are we going to write a cover story that anyone is going to bother reading about the guy who's been president of the United States for 4 years? He's not going to sit down with me at Camp David and answer questions. So I decided what I'll do is I'll write about people who have had interactions with him over the first 4 years in office. And one instance that I had read about that I was curious about were a group of parents of young men who had been killed in the Battle of Mogadishu, had gone to the White House to meet with Bill Clinton, and I thought, well, that would be a good scene in that piece for the magazine. And in the process of reporting that, I met Jim Smith, whose son Jamie had been killed. We talked about the meeting with Clinton, and that his memory of that is in that story. But at the same time, I said, I'm really interested in writing more about what happened in Mogadishu. So some months later, I got an invitation in the mail to a little ceremony up in New Jersey where they were dedicating a building to the memory of his son. And I just felt like, I could feel for Jim. I had sons of my own. I could empathize with his loss, and he'd taken the trouble to invite me. So I just drove up there to be nice. And it turned out, I would know this now, but I did not know this then, that all these guys who had fought with Jamie in Somalia came for this ceremony. So here were all these guys in secret units who would otherwise never have spoken to a reporter. And because the father of their friend who had been killed came up to them and said, "This is Mark Bowden. I'd appreciate it if you'd help him."
So in other words, your biggest break was dumb luck, whereas mine was the hard scut work of going to Odessa, Texas.
I remember,
and
Buzz,
embedding myself.
do you remember that long hallway at the Inquirer
Yes,
to the
I do.
cafeteria? I remember, Buzz, I wrote a book before you wrote your
Yes,
book.
I know, Mark. You did.
Yeah,
Yes.
okay.
Dr.
And so-
Dealer, Mark. I know.
And so Buzz stopped me in the hallway and he said, "Mark, I've got this idea. I want to write a book." And he told me about, he wants to go to Texas and write about a high school football team. What do you think? And I think I encouraged him because I was happy
did.
to see him
You
leave
did.
the newsroom. Yeah.
Mark, when you look for a story, it's not that you go in with a preconceived notion, but you're a great storyteller.
Thank you.
Is that what you're primarily looking for? Is there a story to be told? I mean, have you had stories where I just don't see a narrative, so I'm just not going to do it? Or are you skilled enough to sort of find a narrative in whatever you do?
I think I find a narrative generally, and I just believe that because there is one. I mean, ultimately, any story that you write, if it's a true story, and you go to the people who are directly involved, who care the most, they have stories to tell. And I think that the challenge sometimes is to figure out what that story is and how to report it. But I definitely proceed in that way. I look for what I call the narrative spine. I don't think anyone will read a 20,000 word piece if it's all me lecturing about one subject or another. But if I can bring in scenes and characters and a plot, that I can just about do anything at that point.
Is that something, I know you've been teaching for a long time. I taught this past fall, and I go back and forth in this. Is that something that can be taught, or is that something that you think almost comes instinctually and then you kind of hone it? Or was that something you learned through your newspaper work, obviously the Baltimore, were you at the Sun or the News American?
The News American.
News American or at the Inquirer. But is that something that is innate within you, that idea to tell a story?
Well, I don't think it's innate, although I do think some people are more gifted than others. I think I probably would have developed faster as a reporter and a writer if I had had someone point out things to me when I was younger. Here's how you do it. You should be looking for these things. This is how you go about it. But there are some people you can tell those things to who are never really going to learn how to do it. I learn by imitating writing that I admire.
And so who was that?
Tom Wolfe, Gay Talese, John Hersey, who I dedicated this book to, writers who back in the 50s and 60s were turning out these very powerful short narratives about real events. Norman Mailer, and if you're serious about wanting to be a good writer, you don't just read those things and then lean back and say, "Boy, that was really cool." You actually go back and reread them, you outline them.
Did you ever diagram? I mean, you would diagram?
I would do it, and I'd sometimes write out longhand whole passages from books that I admired, because it forced me to slow down as a reader and basically digest what was written at the same pace as the person who wrote it. And it's amazing how much you learn when you do that. So for me, it still is a very deliberate process, where if I read something that I admire, I'll reread it, I'll stop and think about it, and I'll ask myself, how did the writer do this? You know, what was the train of thought that led to this?
I'll be happy to tell you afterwards.
Good. I do it with your work, too.
I'm
Buzz.
being just a smart ass. That's basically what I do for a living now. When did you know you wanted to be a writer?
I was always interested in it. I remember writing a letter to DC Comics when I was about 8 years old.
Really?
Because I loved comic books, and I also loved to draw. So I wrote a letter saying I wanted to do comic books for them, and they wrote me back. Whoever it was I wrote to wrote me back and said, great, go ahead, do it. And of course I thought, oh God, what do I do now? So I never actually wrote a comic book, but the idea was there. I started trying to write a novel when I was in the 7th grade.
Really?
On my dad's
Were
old
your parents, I
motorcycle.
mean, what did your parents do?
My dad was a business executive. He sold concrete. And my mom had 8 kids at home, so she
8 kids. Were there
had her
writers
own
in the family? I'm just curious. Were there writers in the family or just
No.
something? No.
I had no idea how anyone. My mom used to go to the library. She was an avid reader, and she would bring home a pile of books like every week, and she would take me with her sometimes. And I loved wandering around the library, picking books off the shelf. And I would look. They had always, and they still do this, but even more so, 20 or 30 years ago, they had portraits of writers on the back of them. And the portraits were always very fascinating. You know, writers just looked to me like fascinating people, adventuresome people. You know, I
We've
thought,
gone fucking downhill, I can tell you.
I want to be that guy. You know, so you know, I always had that interest. And really, for me, the turning point, because there were at that point when I was young, I had a lot of things I thought about wanting to do. But I went to Loyola College in Baltimore, and they had all incoming freshmen took a composition test at Loyola, and if you passed it, you didn't have to take a dreaded first-year course called freshman comp. And so I took the test, and I passed it, and I was thrilled, and I went to meet with my faculty advisor, Tom Shy, and Tom said, I'm only going to give you one piece of advice, and I may never give you any more in your 4 years here, but take freshman comp, even though you passed the test, because you will learn how to be a better writer. And it was working with him in that class that made me feel like I could do this. You know, and he made me feel like I was good at it.
You know, it's interesting, now you talk about author pictures, because I always wondered why you were smoking a pipe when you wrote Bringing the Heat about the Eagles.
I wasn't. You know, it was Kramer who always had the most dramatic
No, they did.
author photos.
But I love that story about your mother, because I think that's really seminal. I mean, I think that's how people fall in love with books and fall in love with writing. It's
Well, the
those,
other thing
it's
is
those
that
little
I should
little
add,
tiny things.
Is that my grandmother, you asked if I had any writers in the family. My grandmother, my paternal grandmother, taught writing, like to a correspondence class. And so when my mom and dad would make us occasionally write like letters to our grandparents, thanking them for things or whatever. And so I was forced at one point to write a letter to my grandmother, and I wrote her this letter, which was about an ice skating race that I had been in. And it was all basically a long excuse for why I didn't win the race, even though I was the best skater and I should have won the race. And she wrote me back, and she wrote what a wonderful letter I had written, and she was so thrilled to get it. And I really liked the way that you described, you know, this. In other words, she wrote me about my writing. So on the one hand, she made me feel like that I had skills. And on the other hand, she made me realize that this is something that you can actually think about and do deliberately. And really, from that point on, if I was the one kid in school who, when we had an essay test, everyone in the classroom would groan, and I would go, yes.
In this collection, and I have many, many favorites, and I'm always curious, is there a single piece that resonated with you the most out of this collection? Something that you just felt?
I love the title piece in this book, The Three Battles of Wanat. And I do...
And talk a little bit about, just so people know, it's a very, very morally, humanly complex story about, I don't want to give it away, about who we think is the hero who turns out to be something. And that's what I love the piece, and I love about Mark's. There's a lot of human complexity, and what I really like about the way you write is you never overdo it. Okay. Even when you're critical, there's a real humanity that comes out. But it's a very moral, about a battle in Afghanistan and some really painful surprises as to who's the hero and who's the villain that's putting it badly. But how did you get that story?
Actually, that was Cullen's idea. Cullen Murphy came to me at dinner and he said, why don't you write about the Battle of Wanat? And I had never heard of it.
Take us through, because I think it's interesting to me and other people. All right, you get an assignment.
Right.
That's a big assignment, right?
Yep.
All you know is he gives you a clip, right, or whatever. So what's your first move?
Start reading about it, find out what's out there, find out what others have written about
Right.
it, as much as I can, find out who I should talk to
Right.
to learn more, and
Right.
then you begin that
Right.
process. And I have to say that, I think Cullen's idea and my idea when I started was I had written Black Hawk Down. I had never written since then a story about a battle. This was at that point the bloodiest day in the history of the war.
How many died?
In
14?
Afghanistan. There were 9 were killed and I think 15 American soldiers were injured.
It's an incredible story. I really urge.
And
that
so
you-
my initial thought was I need to talk to all these guys who survived this battle and write and really bring it to life, really describe in the way that I did with Black Hawk Down what happened.
And were they open to talking? Were they
Yes.
still in the military? Or were they? Some were in, some were out. Right?
Most of them were still in, but you begin with the guys that you can find right away, which are the guys who are still in command or who are still there.
And they're willing to.
They're usually willing, yeah. And they were unusually willing in this case for reasons that I learned later. And then you always ask, who else should I talk to? And then that leads you to buddies who are no longer in the Army, or that's how you work your way into the story.
Right.
But it turned out that this wasn't just a story about a battle.
No.
Because this particular day of conflict had instigated a series of Army investigations that had, in the first round of investigations, basically blamed the entire chain of command for failing in their responsibilities. And so there were everyone from the general who was in charge of the brigade down to the company captain who was awarded the Silver Star for heroism in the battle, were all issued letters of what do you call it? They were condemned. They were criticized.
Reprimand, right?
Reprimands.
Which kills your career.
Totally,
in the military.
And I mean everyone was cashiered up and down. And then the third battle is that the colonel, who was the primary person responsible for those men at that combat outpost, had the opportunity to then appeal the initial investigation and got every single letter of reprimand, the entire interpretation turned completely around. And so I was, at that point, really intrigued about not just what happened in Afghanistan, but why? Why was there this cascading series of investigations and charges and reversals? And it turned out to be a story that combined 3 big interests of mine, or things that registered with me. One is combat, which I think is an enormously powerful and important thing to try to understand and write about. The other was fatherhood. This turns out to be the story of a father who was a retired Army colonel who was so grief-stricken, but also, as it turned out, guilty, because he had pulled strings to get his young son, a lieutenant, in this forward combat operating post in order to further his son's career, and had gotten his son killed. And so his grief combined with anger, and he used his connections in the Army to not just instigate, but ultimately, as I learned, to steer the initial investigations, which ended up cashiering all these officers up and down. So it was really unfair what had happened to them. But to wade into this story, which was so contentious, was fascinating to me, because you talk to a different person and you get a completely different take on.
What about documents? Were they classified, or documents available?
The documents, a lot of them were available because they had been included in the investigations.
Okay.
And so all these investigations come with a narrative, but also then with an appendix. And so you can go back and actually look at the original after-action reports, and it's very thoroughly documented.
I may be wrong, and this may be black. Doesn't the military often record or videotape battles?
They
Are
do.
you able to? Did you see those in Mogadishu? Were you able to?
I was,
How did you get those?
Uh,
I mean, because that's amazing. Because then it's all
well,
firsthand. Right?
again, that was long into the reporting process.
Did you run around the room screaming and that must
It was-
have been the
yeah,
gotcha moment,
It's
right?
actually a funny story.
That's when you know you have the book, right?
Well, I thought I had the book already.
But then
But then I
like-
really knew I
right,
had the book.
right.
I had been after one of the commanding officers of the Task Force Ranger in Mogadishu for years, and I could never get him to talk to me. And he lived on a ranch in Texas. He was no longer in the military. He had been, basically his career was over because of the Battle of Mogadishu. So eventually, he called me, or returned a call, and he said, well, yeah, if you want to talk to me, come on out here and I'll talk to you. So I flew out to Dallas and rented a car and drove out to Hyco, Texas. And this retired military officer had his own office on the ranch. It was actually, must have been like a converted milk barn or something. And he had a tremendous library. And he had a bottle of Blanton's bourbon and a lineup of cigars. And for an entire afternoon, he talked to me about, what happened in Mogadishu. So it was a great interview. The whole time after the first drink, I'm taking the bourbon and pouring it into the planter
Pussy.
alongside, because I needed to be able to keep my wits about me. To this day, I
you
think,
would not last in Odessa, Texas for 3 days. So.
to this day, I think I have a reputation for being a really serious drinker,
Did you really do that?
I did that. Of course not. I'm not going to drink that much bourbon. I love it, but I'm not going to drink that much. So anyway, at the end of our conversation, he says to me, I'm going to be gone tomorrow, but you can come back and use my office if you want. And I said, well, thanks, but I was figuring on flying home. I don't really need to use your office. Yeah, you're going to want to use my office. I'll leave the door open. You just let yourself in. He said, and there's this box over in the corner. You might want to take a look in that box when you get here. So I canceled my flight, rescheduled it, drove out there the next day. He was gone, good to his word. Door was open, went in. In that box were all of the official documentation of this battle, the minutes, the
Now I really fucking hate you.
audio tape, videotape.
Isn't that the greatest? I mean, sir, isn't it an orgasmic moment when you report?
It's
Seriously,
the next
I mean,
big
isn't that
challenge
the
was,
best feeling in the world?
It is the best.
Isn't it?
It is. I mean,
makes it worth it,
It
right?
is the pot of gold at the end
Because
of the
it's a
rainbow.
constant detective story. It's a mystery.
And
You're
it
uncovering. It must have been
doesn't
fantastic.
happen all that often.
No, but
when it does, you're overwhelmed with joy. Yeah, I was like running around the room looking for the remainder of the Blantons to celebrate. But the big challenge though was, how do I record?
Yeah.
How can I take
Right.
this home with me? You didn't tell me I could take it. So I actually found the nearest Kinko's, which was about a 2.5-hour drive away, loaded up the car with piles of these, they had transcripts of all the audio tapes, drove and got the Kinko's people to copy it all. And then I went out in the car and I put the audio tape on in the car radio and I recorded it with my little handheld
Did you really?
recorder. Yeah. I couldn't figure out how to copy the video tape.
yeah. So what did you do?
Took notes.
Oh, you took notes. You
I
couldn't,
watched
you couldn't
it
copy it.
over and over, and I just made detailed notes. And it was interesting when I wrote that story and it first started running in the Enquirer. There were a lot of people who were asking questions and commenting on it online. And I think just because a lot of people just assumed that a reporter was not going to really know that much about what happened in Mogadishu, people were writing in saying he's making all this up. This didn't happen the way he's, and I knew that it was true. I mean, I had literally seen it and listened to it as it unfolded. So later, these same people were writing back saying, well, I was wrong. You do actually know what you're talking about. But, this is a feature of modern life. I mean, just imagine trying to write a book about the Battle of the Little Bighorn and somebody says, "Oh, there's videotape," So you don't have to
Now,
even
back then, that
speculate.
would have been amazing.
That would have been amazing. That would have been a story in itself.
We're going to take questions in 1 second, but and this is serious. One of the things I do envy about Mark is that you have a lot of confidence. You seem to really not suffer a lot of writer's block. You just have a real confidence about yourself, and you really like people. Is there anyone you've written about who you ended up detesting?
I didn't like Donald Trump. True. And I wrote a little piece about it for Vanity Fair just a few weeks back, where I wrote about how he's the only person I ever wrote about who tried to bribe me in the course of doing the story. I was doing a profile of him for Playboy magazine, and I think he had thrown a temper tantrum down in Florida, which was so ridiculous. I had never seen a grown man behave so foolishly and petulantly in my life. And so he came up to me after he threw this temper tantrum. He said, "Well, I guess that's going to end up in your story." And I said, "Pretty much." Yeah. And so he was worried about this story. So on the flight on the way home, he says, "I'm looking for somebody to write my next book." I love that line, by the way. I'm looking for somebody to write my next book.
I fall for it every time.
I told him I wasn't interested, and he said, "Why not? All my books are bestsellers." So I did not like Donald for a lot of reasons, and I ended up really not liking David Simon a whole lot.
And David Simon is the creator of The Wire, which he's an asshole. I happen to know.
Well, he's brilliant, though. I mean, I think
don't
The
care, he's an
Wire
asshole.
is the best TV series I've ever seen. But I made the mistake of writing critically about David Simon, by which I mean not criticizing him, but actually making an effort to try to understand what was his message. And if you study David Simon, what you learn is that David is angry at everyone and everything. And this is the wellspring of his creative energy, which is perfectly legitimate and fine, except he was so infuriated by this insight that he began a campaign at the Atlantic to get me cashiered and wrote letters, claiming that I had misled him about this, that, and the other. And of course, they all said to me, "He really is the angriest guy in the world." And honestly, my fondest hope, one of the things that David does is if you watch his shows, and he hates a lot of people, me included, he'll name despicable characters in his shows after people he doesn't like. And because there are all these people who we share a past with, people in the newspaper business, I recognize these people and these names. Well, my fondest hope with David is that I get to be a villainous, evil character in one of his stories. I'm still hoping.
I think.
Hi there, sir. It's a pleasure to meet you again.
Thank you.
One of my questions is what was I read almost all your books, but I was just curious, what was your easiest book to write about, and how long did it take?
Ooh.
Good question.
I think probably the easiest of the books that I wrote, and I hasten to add that it was not easy, but easier, was a book that I wrote called The Best Game Ever, about the 1958 NFL championship game. It was a fairly confined event. I mean, it's a football game. And I really enjoyed the characters in that story, going to meet them and interview them. There was video of the game. Andy Reid agreed to sit down and review the game film with me and gave me, broke it down for me and gave me real insight into the strategies that were being employed. I had been a football writer, and I'd probably over the 3 years I worked as football writer at the Inquirer, I wrote probably 30 or more game stories, and all of them sucked. And the reason they sucked is because I don't think any reporter, having watched a football game, can sit down and tell you even why one team was better than the other. The only way you can ever really understand what goes on in a football game is to study the film. And there was never time to do that. So I'd always wanted to write a game story where I actually knew what I was talking about. And that's what that book is. That is a book about a game where I actually know what I'm talking about.
How long did it take you to write?
It was about a year and a half. Yeah. And a lot of the guys that I interviewed were, former Baltimore Colts players, so they lived in the Baltimore area. Raymond Barry, who was the star of that game, is such an incredibly interesting guy. He is so meticulous that he still had in his office down in Tennessee a loose leaf binder for each of the 12 seasons that he played in the NFL, and each game that he played was there. And for every game, he sketched out for himself. This is long before there were position coaches in the NFL and they studied video of everybody. He studied his own film and would draw up plays and routes that he wanted to run and then share them with the team. And so he was the treasure chest in that book, you know, in the way that the general was a treasure chest for Black Hawk Down.
I really enjoyed your talk.
Thank you.
There have been conflicting accounts of who shot Osama bin Laden. Is this fog of war? How do you account for that?
The only conflict that matters at all is who was second or third in line who actually delivered the kill shot, because you have two different SEALs who have given slightly different stories, and I do think it's just fog of war. You know, my reading of it is I don't believe I've met these guys and talked to them, and I don't believe that either of them is lying, but I think in the confusion of the moment, they're working in darkness, wearing night vision goggles, running around in a very small house up a staircase. I think one or the other of them was confused about where they were in the order going up the steps. And that makes a big difference, because then you either become the guy who shot him first or you become the guy who came up and shot him second. So it doesn't amount to a very significant difference, in my opinion. However, Seymour Hersh has, the famous investigative reporter, has written a completely alternate account of what happened, which I believe is completely false. So,
the context is you obviously wrote a book about the hunt for bin Laden, correct?
Right, and spent well over a year talking to dozens of people who were directly involved in finding him, who took part in the mission to kill him, talked to the president in the Oval Office for an hour and a half, put together a story based on all these different accounts of the people who were directly involved. And then Seymour, about a year later, writes this article based on two unnamed sources who told him a completely different story.
Are you at all concerned about this sort of instant history where an event happens and then immediately someone's writing about it and someone's writing about it, and events don't have time to really sort of gestate and kind of grow, and that everyone has a sort of different take for whatever reason, whether it's, there is a big difference between number one and number two who shot bin Laden. It's the difference between a bestseller and a book no one gives a shit about.
Yeah, that's true.
And there was a Jonathan Mahler piece in the New York Times Magazine that was kind of loaded, but is that a problem? I mean, they're having a Pulitzer celebration. One of the panels is, what will be the history of Obama? Well, he's still fucking president. What can the history possibly be?
Yeah.
But there'll be 15 or 20 books, and they'll all be different,
Yep.
and some will have a different take, some of it to sell. Do you worry about that?
I'm not too worried about it. I think that's always been a feature of journalism in America. I mean, there were people who wrote about Abe Lincoln within months after he was murdered, who knew him personally. And those books are tremendous resources for anyone who now writes about Abe Lincoln, because they were able to talk to firsthand witnesses, people who worked with him, who knew him when he was younger. So I don't believe that the story is finished when those initial accounts come out. But I do think that there is something very valuable about material that comes from the people who were actually there and present. And I think it's also incumbent on whoever writes those stories, and myself included, not to make more of what you know than you have. I mean, I think if you read, for instance, my book about the killing of bin Laden, it doesn't offer a lot of analysis about what this means for the long term and what the significance of it would be. It does offer you a lot of particulars about exactly how that process unfolded and who made what decision when and why.
Whereas I understand, and we'll take another question, the Cy Hirsch version, I think, is based on one unnamed source, correct?
Yeah, yeah. And there's just absolutely no proof for it. So.
Sure.
I'd like to know from each one of you, what is your next project? What are you working on now? Including you, Buzz.
Buzz, you go first.
I've decided to do this. I gave it a lot of thought, and I'm not immune to the financial ramifications. I'll admit this. But I'm collaborating on a book with Caitlyn Jenner. I had a long.
Buzz did the story in Vanity Fair.
I did the story in Vanity Fair, and I think there is an important book there. I think there's a terrific book there. But before I went back and forth, these books are journalistic departures. But the week before we met with publishers, I went to LA and I met with her and I said, look, if you're going to do this, you're in for a dime, you're in for a dollar. Everything has to be on the table. You have to be honest about everything, and I'll hold you accountable because I'm going to do a reported book. And I'm going to interview you and the 100 people who knew you, because I think her story is really not known in terms of the pain, the difficulty, the insularity, the fear, the dishonesty, the deception, which are all great moments of drama, and it's still unfolding. This was someone who was utterly tortured for over 50 years. And when she won the Olympics as Bruce, it got worse, because suddenly she is this male, macho, mom and apple pie model. And her suffering, and I thought I knew her from the Vanity Fair piece, her suffering and her pain and her guilt and this desire that she deserved pain, that she hated herself, that God had condemned her, is pretty powerful stuff. And so I think it's worth doing. So that's what I'm doing.
I'm working on a book, and my publisher has actually asked me not to talk specifically about what it's about, but it's about an event in Vietnam that goes back to 1968. I've been working on it for the last 4 years. I'm going back to Vietnam next week to do the last reporting trip there. So that's the big project for me, and I've been teaching for the last 12 years or so. I'm taking off from teaching it in May of this year, and I'll spend the rest of the year just finishing that book. But I am working on another thing, which at the same time, which I don't know where it's going to end up or what it's going to be, but the first story that I ever wrote as a journalist of any consequence was back in 1974 at the Baltimore News-American, and my job was to come into the newsroom at 4 o'clock in the morning and call every police barracks in the state, long list of phone numbers, and I would call them and say, did anything happen overnight? And 99.9% of the time it was, nope, nothing happened. But the instructions were, if something interesting happened, I was to leave the building, take a car, drive there, and start reporting, because it was an afternoon paper, and you could sometimes even, get a story in the paper that morning. So this call was to Bethesda, Maryland, and cops said, yeah, these 2 little girls disappeared yesterday, so everybody's looking for them. So I went down. These are the Lyons sisters. Has anybody ever heard of the Lyons sisters? You could Google it, Lyons. 2 beautiful little girls who had gone off from their house to the mall and never came home. And so I spent 2 or 3 weeks as a 22, 23-year-old kid trying to figure out how to be a reporter, basically going back and forth from the family, from John and Mary Lyons' house to the police who were trying to find these girls, and writing story after story after story, all of which came to naught. They never found what happened. Well, about 4 months ago, I was reading the New York Times, and there was a little item on page 6 saying that they had figured out who kidnapped and killed the Lyons girls, and it was a guy who's locked up in the prison here in Delaware, who has yet to be charged, but will soon be charged with this crime. So I just thought, I need to know how this happened. How did they find and connect that case to this guy after 35, 40 years? So I started going down to Bethesda about a month or 2 ago, interviewing the detectives who unraveled this case. And it turns out that the way that this case was built is through a long series of interrogations in the prison with this suspect. And they have recordings of all of these interviews. And so I'm going to be wading into all of that material to try to reconstruct how they caught this guy, and then also finally, tell the story of what happened to Sheila and Catherine Lyons.
And I'm also moving to San Francisco to become Chip Kelly's PR rep.
In your one story about the Philippines with the terrorists and the informer that helped capture the leader at the end, and he got his reward from the Philippine government, but he never got it from the U.S. government.
Right.
Did you ever do any research to find out why he didn't get it from the U.S.?
They wouldn't tell me. I mean, I think I wrote at the end of that story that I think he deserved the reward.
Yeah, you did.
And but they never gave it to him, and no one was able to explain to me why they didn't. They didn't offer to answer my question.
The story is called Jihadis in Paradise. It's an incredible story. It's a wonderful, wonderful story that I really recommend. It's both hair-raising and funny and brilliantly reported. Really terrific story.
To do that story, I went and stayed for a little while on this little island in the Philippines called Jolo, Jollo, and ran into Robert Kaplan, and there were only about 2 or 3 national correspondents for the Atlantic. And I didn't know he was in the Philippines. And I thought, boy, we've got the Philippines covered.
I hope this question is not too painful because you are truly among friends. And I'm also very curious about Buzz's answer to this. But have you ever written a book or a story that you've come later to regret that if you had to do over again, you wouldn't? And I can imagine that it's because there are unintended consequences, collateral damage, information that comes out later that changes the whole narrative.
Yeah, I mean, I think probably for me, there are stories that I wrote a long time ago that if I had them to do over again, I would do differently because I've gotten better at what I do. I don't recall really ever writing a story that damaged or hurt anyone that badly. I was subpoenaed to testify at a murder trial in Philadelphia when I wrote a series of stories about a guy named Brian Tyson who killed a man in North Philadelphia and who was subsequently tried. And the prosecutors tried to get me to testify, and I refused, and I was fined like $40,000, which the Inquirer had to pay. So I had some regrets about that one, especially as I sat in the courtroom with the toothbrush in my backpack, not knowing if I was going home that day. There was a story I wrote, which is in my first collection, about a doctor named Mike McConnell who committed suicide. And there was a detail in that story that I believed was tremendously significant. And his widow begged me not to put that in the story, and I left it out. And I regret leaving that out. Only because, but I don't regret having made the decision I made, but it would have made the story a better story if I'd put it in. But I actually think I made the right call. So.
I can't recall writing a story that I regret. I've written at least one story. I think there's one that I remember where all the information was told to me on the record several times, and I knew it was bullshit. I knew it wasn't true, but it was too good an ending, so I put it in anyway. It was a story about Joe DiMaggio through the point of view of his lawyer, Morris Engelberg, who was a publicity hound, but knew DiMaggio well, very, very well. And he said he was with DiMaggio, which he was, when he died. Such bullshit, but it was too good not to put in. And I knew it. And I'm embarrassed to say it because it was so fucking ridiculous. He said that DiMaggio's final words right before he died were, "Now I can be with Marilyn." Well, I knew that was fucking crock of shit. I mean, I think the guy was in a coma, but I put it in anyway. Because, fuck it, DiMaggio's dead. What the fuck is he going to do? I knew it was bullshit. And then I heard later from a fellow Inquirer reporter that actually he stole his rings off his fingers. So it's not always a healthy profession, despite what we say.
This is for both of you. Did you gentlemen see Spotlight, and was that on spot with what happens in the newsroom?
Yeah, boring and plotting, yes.
I liked it, but it was slow-moving, and it did, I think, accurately depict how reporters really work.
Yeah, it's not very glamorous. I thought the movie was I didn't think the movie was great, but I thought the movie was good, and I think it reflected what it's like. And what I did like was it didn't let the Globe off. I mean, the Globe had that information several years earlier, and certainly gave the suggestion because it was so tied into Catholicism in the church that it didn't do anything. And I give whoever did that a lot of credit.
Yeah, and I agree, and I think it was smart the way they depicted how newspapers are influenced, not so
Yes,
much
right.
by somebody coming and saying, you know, I'm going to take out all my advertising if you write the story, but rather are influenced by the culture that they're part of. And, you know, newspaper reporters and editors are far more likely to censor themselves than they are to be bullied into being censored.
Right. And we'll take one more question, but the point I want to make too is for Mark to get to that point where he gets the box of the audio and the video took years, right?
4 years, yeah.
It's not glamorous work. It's not. It's a lot of dead ends. Right. You're kept alive by that one got you interview, but Spotlight reflects that. It's
right.
Very,
and, you know, when I
very,
read about
very meticulous, and then there's that one little nugget that keeps you going. But investigative reporting is very, very difficult.
And it is, to me, it's a little bit annoying that the perception of journalists is that we sort of sit around and wait for somebody to hand us a story. Right. You know, for the great source to call you and like El Chapo calling Sean Penn, you know, and giving him a story. You know, hats off, you know, to Sean for being the lucky recipient of the El Chapo interview.
Yeah, but you heard what he said today. He's just like a true journalist. He really fucked up my story when he got arrested.
There you go. He's learning.
When he got recaptured, it really fucked me up, man. Spoken like a true journalist, right?
Mr. Bissinger, this is for Mr. Bowden, but I have to tell you, Friday Night Lights was the best book.
Oh, you can keep going.
One of the best movies and the best TV series. Mr.
He should have
Bowden.
left out all that stuff about finances.
Thank you.
Didn't want to hurt his feelings.
Thank you.
Mr. Bowden, you mentioned very early in your presentation tonight, you went to the White House for a reception for the Battle of Mogadishu veterans. And I can't remember whether it was in your book or someplace else, about President Clinton's having made a decision about not having an AC-130 gunship to cover the Blackhawks and everything was going on.
Yep.
And I was wondering if that subject came up during this reception for these veterans.
It did. And in fact, you know, I didn't fully explain why I thought that meeting would have been particularly interesting to learn about and write more about. And it was because there was a lot of criticism on the part of the families and in some aspects of the military about that decision not to send armored personnel carriers or an AC-130 gunship over with the force package. And he was called out on that in that meeting. You can read about it in my old magazine piece in the Sunday Philadelphia Inquirer.
All right, well, I think that's it. Mark, thank you. It was a pleasure. It was really fun. Thank you all. Thank you.